great. Well, today I have with me Susan Wolf. Susan is the Edna J. Corey Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at UNC Chapel Hill, and she works chiefly in ethics and its close relations in philosophy of mind, philosophy of action, political philosophy, and aesthetics. Her interests range widely over moral psychology, value theory, and normative ethics. And today I'm going to talk with Susan Wolf about her work mainly in moral responsibility. So thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
So I've been kind of I think I mentioned this to you in the email where I reached out to you over, and yeah, I've been kind of working my way through some classic papers in moral responsibility, and I read recently two of yours, your 1980 paper Asymmetrical Freedom, and then the 81 paper The Importance of Having Free Will. And if I'm correct, those were actually your first two papers you published. Is that right?
Probably, yes. I think
Okay. Okay. And I loved both of these papers. I think I told you I read The Importance of Having Free Will first. And that is a paper that I've reread a couple times since the first reading. And I think I told you, it's such a wonderful paper because you kind of have this reveal at the end of the paper, the main kind of turn, the point you make. And it's a wonderful paper. So I'll post the PDFs to both of those if people want to read either of them.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
I was curious before we talk about both of the papers. I was just curious how you got into being interested in free will and moral responsibility in the first place.
Oh gosh. Well, it's probably hard to say. I mean, from my perspective, who isn't interested in free will and moral responsibility? It seems like this is a big question that it's very common for people to get worried about. I mean, the simple thought is determinism might be true, especially I think in our secular world, physiological determinism might be true, right? And that seems pretty quickly to get you into thinking, oh my gosh, I have no control over anything I do. It's all an illusion that I'm anything, and it's very upsetting. So I guess I think that's really common. It's I think a bit of a folk wisdom in philosophy that, well, if you're trying to get somebody interested in philosophy, just start talking about free will, because people get into it really quickly and they just want to, fight it out or lose sleep over it or whatever. And so, yeah, it seems to be a pretty basic question. And then I guess the only other thing to say more personally is somehow, and I don't really know how, I got the idea from, I don't know, my teachers, my fellow students, that people didn't talk about that anymore, that somehow it was a non-issue. It was maybe compatible. I think compatibilism, the view that determinism isn't really a threat, that's just an illusion, was the truth. And so it wasn't interesting to talk about it anymore. And then I took a seminar in graduate school with the person who became my advisor, Thomas Nagel, he's a very independent thinker, and he believes, look, these philosophical problems, they're really deep and they're never, he didn't follow custom, and he sort of made it permissible to think, wait a second, what's really going on here? He allowed he allowed me to ask the question and to take it seriously, and to realize that all these people who think, we're above that, we're not, didn't really have a good basis for that. And so that sort of gave me the courage to work on it as a.
Wow, that's so cool. I didn't know Nagel was your advisor. His moral luck paper is a classic one in this area.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, it's It's interesting because I mean, I found my way into this literature when I was pretty young. I grew up in like a deeply Christian household, and so the problem of theological determinism and foreknowledge was, a central. It was really kind of my first skeptical doubts about God's existence. Is it's part of the thesis really of the Bible is that we have free will, and that's what hinges heaven and hell upon. And so God's foreknowledge for all of that just was so interesting to me, and that's what really got me into philosophy generally.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
that
it's
makes
so
a
it's
lot of
so
sense.
cool. Yeah.
So on that topic, I don't know if you have studied Leibniz at all, but
Not a whole lot, no.
well, in thinking about about divine determinism and free will, I think he's great. So
Okay.
recommend.
Okay, great. I'll have to look into him. Yeah, I think we only touched maybe a reading here or there in my undergrad work on Leibniz. But yeah, so let's get into the paper specifically. Working with the paper that I read first, The Importance of Free Will. That paper is really largely about the importance of the reactive attitudes and the potential threat that determinism kind of intuitively gives us towards the idea that, oh, we ought to take the objective stance because it is as you say, in accordance with the facts. But maybe before getting into kind of the main turn of the paper, maybe you could say a word about what I mean by objective and reactive attitudes.
Ah, good. Right. So that the term reactive attitudes was coined by P.F. Strawson in another very classic, deep and difficult paper called Freedom and Resentment. As was the term, the objective attitude, which he used to contrast it. So basically, the best thing to do would actually be to read what he says, I think. But if you don't want me to do that, I will.
If you want to, sure.
I'll start with actually some words of mine. In that article, Strawson wants to focus on what he calls the non-detached attitudes and reactions of offended parties and beneficiaries of such things as gratitude, resentment, forgiveness, love, and hurt feelings, which he calls attitudes of involvement or participation in human relationships. And he contrasts them with the objective attitude. And here's the long quotation where he's describing the objective attitude. To adopt the objective attitude to another human being is to see him perhaps as an object of social policy, as a subject for what, in a wide range of sense, might be called treatment, as something certainly to be taken account, perhaps precautionary account of, to be managed or handled or cured or trained, perhaps simply to be avoided. The objective attitude may be emotionally toned in many ways, but not in all ways. It may include repulsion or fear. It may include pity or even love, though not all kinds of love. It cannot include the range of reactive feelings and attitudes which belong to involvement or participation with others in interpersonal human relationships. It cannot include resentment, gratitude, forgiveness, anger, or the sort of love which two adults can sometimes be said to feel reciprocally for each other. If your attitude towards someone is wholly objective, then though you may fight with him, you cannot quarrel with him. And though you may talk to him, even negotiate with him, you cannot reason with him. You can at most pretend to quarrel or to reason with him.
Mm.
So basically, I mean, Strawson's idea is that when we regard each other as morally responsible for what we're doing, for what we do, that goes hand in hand with thinking it appropriate to blame or credit, to resent or feel grateful towards a person for doing what they're doing. It's this idea that, in doing it, you're showing something about who you are, that you're choosing to manifest. And depending on what it is, you'll feel positive or negative feelings towards the other person in connection with that. Whereas when you think, oh, look, you're just an automaton or a lower animal that doesn't have the kind of capacities for these feelings of goodwill or ill will, right? Then you take the objective attitude. You say, this is just the way that breed of dog is, or this is just this is what they're programmed to do. So that's the contact. And I mean, in the paper you're talking about, the importance of free will, it kind of starts with this idea that the reason we care so much about free will, or at least this is the reason I care so much about free will, or the kind of freedom you need to be morally responsible, is because I want those things to be deserved. I want it to be appropriate to either resent me for being bad, or admire me for being good, or love me for being and to feel that way towards another person, to live as if I'm in a world populated by automata would be very chilling.
Mm. Yeah, and it's nicely exemplified. I mean, you say something like this in the paper, but you wouldn't have this certain sort of gratitude or resentment towards your car that had broken down, for instance. Right. You wouldn't really deeply blame the car in the same way that you would deeply blame a person who had wronged you. Right. And so I mean, in the beginning of the paper, this was a point that I said you really changed my mind in the second half of the paper, but in the first part I just had already agreed wholeheartedly with you that these attitudes are exactly what constitute interpersonal life. If I treated people in my life who are close to me under the objective stance in its totality, always viewing them as things to be managed or accounted for, I mean, that would really rob me of the deepest part of my relationship with them. Right. Yeah, and so it's kind of interesting. I mean, when I first started getting into these papers, I had and as you say, it's very natural for us to kind of default to the reactive attitudes. But what's interesting is that I'm sure, as everyone has had taken the objective stance too, but it was more of a I wouldn't have been able to kind of frame it like this. I mean, there's a huge difference. It's not just a difference in degree, it's really a difference in kind, the reactive versus the objective stance. And I love what you say in the paper about how you use this phrase, our relationships would take on a hollow ring if we adopted the objective attitude in its totality. Right. Yeah. And so, then there's, well, I was actually curious. The reason why I had encountered your paper at all was because I had read a more recent paper by Tamler Summers, his 2007 paper. Yeah, you're aware of it, I guess.
Well, I'm not sure which paper. I mean, I know. Mm-hmm. I know his views in general. But...
Mm-hmm. I had read his 2007 paper, The Objective Attitude, where he's directly trying to rebut your thesis there.
Right.
Yeah, and I was curious. I mean, I don't know if you've in writing responded to that paper or not, but I was curious. Do you have any thoughts on that paper?
It's been so long ago that that I read it. I think I thought it was a good paper, but didn't convince me. So yeah, but I think I'm not really in a position to respond to it now.
Yeah, it's a really good paper, but again, I didn't find it too convincing. And what's funny is he has since kind of reneged on that paper too, and said that this was just totally not my views at this point, and he reverts much more to Strawson's perspective now. Which is cool. But yeah, I've encountered, I was like, I think I mentioned to you in the email, I had discussed your paper with a few friends, and one friend in particular had agreed with Summers there. And we were going back and forth, and I couldn't, it was hard for me to it was almost hard for me to believe someone that they wouldn't lose anything if they took the objective stance. Have you encountered people making that claim?
So Tamler himself, I know, I mean, he was actually a graduate student when I was at Duke, when I was at the beginning of my teaching at UNC. So he took a course with me, and he was already kind of a hardline Galen Straussonian as opposed to P.F. Straussonian. and I, and so he was, defending that he had this attitude, that he thought this was the right attitude, but he's also in person like a really appealing person with really good relationships to, and he loves his daughter, he's got good friendships. So I found myself thinking, you think you're doing this, but this is not an accurate description of what you're thinking and feeling about them. That was my attitude at the time. But that's kind of an ad hominem thing that you would have to defend with personal experience. So I'm not really sure what else to say.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's hard to really challenge that without kind of doing a little bit of mind reading, which is always unfair.
Yeah, again, this is kind of ad hominem too. I do think there are people who go through life with more of the objective attitude towards everyone around them, and feel that that's right, and don't feel like they're deprived, or at least they think if I'm living in accord with the facts and so on, or whatever. And I just think, those are people there are limits to the kinds of relationships they can have. And so I would, from the point of view inside of what we'll call a Straussonian set of values, meaning P.F. Strawson, I would regard that as a diminished life. But it's not that it's an unlivable life, or a life that's completely, horrifying. It means that your relationships are much more instrumental, I guess. You might enjoy being with someone, but you don't have a meeting of minds or anything. You can't have that kind of soulmate relationship, and you don't get angry with them. But on the other hand, I think anger is fine. I mean, you can't get close enough to them to be angry at them in the way we might get angry at people we care about.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to change your relationship with people as other potential agents to more of just objects. You're almost kind of surrounding yourself with more and more almost toys in a sense, as opposed to people. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, look, to be fair, I don't want to spend too much time on this if you want to move on. Take a pet. I think I think in Strawson himself would say, the relationships you can have with a pet are all ones that are compatible with objective attitudes. So in the quote I read, it was said, look, there's even a kind of love you can have for someone you take an objective attitude towards, but there are limits to that love, and there's other kinds you can't have. And I mean, I know there'll be a lot of disagreement among pet lovers, depending on what kind of pet they have and so on, about what kinds of relationships are possible. But even someone who is, relatively unsentimental about these things and says, look, I know I know that let it be a dog, though this is one of the more controversial ones for good reason, I think. I wouldn't resent my dog for doing something because they can't really appreciate any reason not to or something. But still, you can really love your dog, and the dog can bring a lot to your life and all, even if you draw the line in a way that you wouldn't to a potential soulmate, so to speak. And so it's not that it's terrible, right? It's just that I'm aiming for something different. And
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Like I have a dog, and yeah, it's a relationship with a dog is just all good. But if every relationship in your life had that quality, something would be totally lost. Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Um, so let's get to the so the major turn of the paper is I think again I said this in the email. I mean, I had to when I first read this point by you, I honestly didn't get it at first. I was like, what is she going on about? This comparison to um you had the change between the unwilling addict and then the determined robot and then our determined selves. And so you lay out the point that there are many reasons, or at least potential reasons, to take either attitude, the objective attitude or the reactive attitude. But one, you might think, very important potential reason to take the objective attitude is that it is an act which is living in accordance with the facts, as you say. So maybe explain, if you could, what you mean by that reason specifically.
Well, let me try anyway. I mean, the thought is, if you believe that if we're completely determined, then um, then it's not really up to us to, you know, believe one thing or another, to choose what, you know, to choose to do one thing or another, and so on. Then, um, then the belief that a person is responsible, or that resenting and feeling grateful to people is appropriate, seems undermined. It seems like, well, if we are these totally determined beings, then we really shouldn't blame someone for being a jerk because he's determined to be a jerk. We shouldn't love someone for being so, kind, and because she's determined to be kind. It's not like she's choosing it. So you might think, a person who's got his eyes open, who's not in denial about the fact of determinism, or in denial about the fact that determinism implies this, is taking their psychology where the arguments lead them, right? I mean, it's just inaccurate to think that they have the kind of freedom that would warrant feelings like resentment and indignation and gratitude and admiration. And so, wanting to, be true to the facts, you stop having those feelings. You take the objective attitude.
Mm-hmm. And the kind of turn in the paper is that even though there's this kind of intuition that I think a lot of people would catch, and I caught it too, is that, oh, it seems like taking the objective attitude, treating people without this kind of guise of agency, is the more rational move to make, because, well, we do assume that people don't have true agency because determinism is true. But you point out, and this was so cool when it finally clicked for me, that actually, the act of taking an attitude, whether it be the reactive or the objective, I mean, to take an attitude, is to act under the guise that you are agentic. And so it's to take the objective attitude is to kind of betray what the thesis of the objective attitude is saying. And so in doing that, even that doesn't conform with the value of living in accordance to the facts, which everyone agrees is a value that, well, most of us hold, at least. Yeah.
Right.
And so you've knocked out that potential value, that a hard incompatibilist would put forth, which is, I mean, it's just a cool point. And it kind of, it left me thinking about, if this isn't a value that is conserved by the objective attitude, then it sort of leaves us in a nice position to kind of think about the maybe costs or benefits of taking either a stance, the objective or the reactive in certain situations. Because like, a lot of my kind of like hopeful projects for grad school are about when either attitude is appropriate. And I was just presenting at a conference a couple weeks ago about, I like one question, for instance, is, I'm wondering, are there certain situations in which we are sort of morally obligated, or maybe just it's permissible to take the objective attitude, um, in order to preserve relationships, and not take them in their totality towards a relationship, but just temporarily to kind of get past, like grease the wheels of the relationship almost. And maybe I could ask you about, a potential example, for instance. So let's say I have a family member, who holds, some very antiquated view, some antiquated moral view, right? And I've talked with this family member, multiple times, just many occasions, just trying to show them why this is just not a factual view to hold. It's not a good moral view to hold, et cetera, right? And, we're at, the Thanksgiving table for the umpteenth time, and that concern gets raised by them. Now, normally your reactive attitudes there would be to, to rebuke the person, to really morally castigate them, right? Like this is not a good view to hold. But I'm wondering, in certain situations like that, I mean, that seems like a pristine case in which the objective attitude taken towards that person, kind of helps you grease the wheels of the Thanksgiving dinner a bit more. And I was curious what you thought about the permissibility of doing something like that.
Right. Well, it's a great example. I'm actually I've returned to thinking about responsibility a lot in my current work, and it's this kind of thing that I'm thinking about a lot.
Okay.
So it's very relevant to my current thoughts. Um, yeah, there's a lot of different ways one could go about this. One thing is to actually refer back to Strawson when he talks about the objective attitude and the reactive attitudes. He mentions specifically that, look, we can take the objective attitude towards people, and the issue is whether you take that exclusively and think like you that, right? But when he talks about how we can do it and sometimes do it, one of the phrases that is very memorable is to remove or reduce the strains of involvement. And I mean, I think that's exactly apt to your kind of example. It's like, if I respond to this person reactively with the participant stance, we are gonna, get into a horrible fight. It'll ruin Thanksgiving dinner. It might ruin our relationship. And so you back off from that and you say, well, he's a creature of his time, and so on. So absolutely that's permissible. That said, I would also want to go in a couple different directions. One is, look, none of us are completely responsible about everything we do. We all have blind spots in which we are behaving like automata. I mean, they're not literally automata, but we're complicated creatures, and we have defects where we can't see certain things, where we just have this uncontrollable response. And you shouldn't take the reactive attitude to them. That doesn't mean, oh, well, they're not responsible human beings. It means with respect, I mean, you can take any kinds, there's hundreds of examples like this. I mean, take someone who's an addict, right? Well, being an addict isn't the only thing about this person, but it could be that with respect to a person's addiction, it could be, and I'm going to keep that open, that it is appropriate. Certainly a therapist is going to want to say, all right, don't regard this as something that the person has the kind of freedom about, the kind of control over, that you should regard them as morally responsible, right? This is something to be dealt with, and it's to be managed, to be treated. This is something maybe the person himself should think of as something to be managed or treated for a while. Maybe. I mean, it's another controversial issue. I don't mean to, put my my foot that too far out on the limb, but I mean, so it's one kind of example. But anyway, right, in lots of ways, someone who is responsible about many, many things and for whom you have a participant relationship will still have aspects of their lives in which are it's just unjustified to regard them as responsible for that, right? So that's one thing. And so then, of course, you have to do that. With respect to a question like an example like yours, where, I mean, let's just take, the person is deeply sexist, let's say, right? And, when these things have come, or, political, I mean, this is a huge thing in families, especially in recent years, where you just feel like you can't talk to this person, or at any rate, you can't convince the person is not going to see things your way. You're not going to see them that way. What should you do? I think these are difficult issues, and you have to, and they're based on what's the right thing to do or the best thing to do is going to be very personal. In a way, I feel like, look, there are a lot of people who, let's take someone you disagree with and where you think they are just not seeing things right, their values are wrong. Maybe you understand where they came from and why they have those values, but you also think, and there's no reason why you shouldn't, they're capable of doing better. I mean, I look at my own life. I have lived through a lot of social changes in which social values and understanding of certain kinds of social issues has really, have really moved far. And, as a creature of my time, I had one set of attitudes when I was in high school, and, and the more I lived, the more I've read, the more I've talked to people, I mean, a lot of my attitudes have changed. And so I know, look, people can change. And sometimes I feel like, well, if you wanted, the right thing to do is to try to get them to change. I mean, if they can. And also to listen to them, because maybe they're the ones who are right and you got to change. I mean, so I don't, when you say, is it permissible to just take the objective attitude, say, look, this is who you are, this is who I am. We're not going to hold each other responsible for that. We're just going to we're just going to manage it. Sometimes that is obviously the right thing to do. Sometimes it's the only right thing to do. Sometimes it's an option that is better, all things considered, for peacefulness, for your own peace of mind, for your relationship, whatever. But sometimes I think people should really try to go beyond that. You have to learn how to go beyond that in a effective way and in a respectful way. But yeah, and sometimes I think if your response to someone, and you go into these arguments, maybe you do it multiple times, and in the end you say, you know what, you're just a jerk for thinking these things, or for going on in this way. Sometimes that's appropriate. So yeah. So I guess I think these are complicated questions, but it's good to at least see them as complicated and nuanced.
And it seems like, I mean, it also seems like taking the objective attitude generally doesn't commit you to necessarily any specific course of action with respect to the conversation. So for instance, you could take the objective attitude and, just completely kind of distance yourself from that person. This is a malfunctioning robot, essentially, right? That has malfunctioned in a way to believe these things. But also you could take the objective stance, as I think Cheshire Calhoun has this paper about, forgiveness in the sense where you're almost separating the action from the person.
Right.
And you can still kind of allow yourself to feel real, deep anger, reactive anger at the views themselves, but sort of take a view towards the person that allows you to hopefully be more persuasive in a way that's not maybe corrupted by your reactivity in that instance, which isn't to say that reactivity isn't sometimes warranted,
Right.
also. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's okay. That's super interesting. um and the point you said about viewing someone kind of as a creature of their time, or something, under the lens of determinism, makes me kind of think about, this is a question that I really wanted to ask you about in Asymmetrical Freedom,
Mhm.
um the earlier paper. So th- this was
By the way, it's the earlier paper in terms of publication. I actually wrote The Importance of Free Will first, but
oh, okay.
didn't send it out for publication, and so it was just that's just
Okay.
a autobiographical fact.
Okay. You know what, that actually makes sense, having read both of the papers. I would see that, yeah, being congruent. So in um Asymmetrical Freedom, I might have mentioned this over email, but you totally changed my mind about what you can do with determinism's truth in the beginning of that paper. So I I had been totally, what I might call now sort of a naive hard incompatibilist, where I would say, you know, well, and it's intuitive. Like, I think almost everyone has this intuition that, if you just admit the thesis of determinism, we are comprised of things that none of us chose, right? None of us are causa sui. And that seems to very directly imply, at least, that no one is morally responsible, or the condition of moral responsibility never obtains. And you point out that, okay, if you're saying that because determinism is true, therefore there is no moral responsibility, the contrapositive of that statement has to be true. So you might ask, what would make moral responsibility obtain? And if you've hinged it on that statement, then you would have to be endorsing the idea that for moral responsibility to be the case, we would have to be undetermined, or live in an indeterminate universe somehow. And you point out that, you know, that condition doesn't really seem to make any sense either, because we would be something very close to Frankfurt's wanton, where we don't have any care really over our desires. We're just kind of moved by the wind almost. Or we would have no character coherence. Am I understanding your point in that paper correctly?
It's been such a long time. I have to remember exactly what the point was. I
Mm,
guess what I was thinking was our understanding of what it would be to be morally responsible. I mean, a morally responsible person is someone who um, is capable of being determined by a recognition of what's right and good. Right? I mean, when we blame someone for not doing what's right and good, it's against the background of thinking you could have recognized what's right and good and behaved that way, and you didn't, and that's why I'm blaming you. And then, of course, in the positive case, when we praise someone for saving the child from from drowning or whatever, it's not just because they did it, but because they did it presumably due to the recognition there's a child who needs help, I have to go in and save them. So the idea there is, in the background of responsibility, of our assumptions of what it would be to be responsible, is the assumption that people are capable of seeing things and having what they see determine what they do,
mm,
right? So the idea that we're not determined by anything seems incompatible with what it would take to be responsible, even though the idea that we are determined by anything seems incompatible with the idea that we could be responsible. That's the paradox.
mhm.
Does that sound like what you're?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And yeah, I mean, it's such a cool point, because you don't, I'll just say, like, when you're first, like, as a person who's kind of new to this literature, generally speaking, I mean, the incompatibilist intuition there is so, it just seems so obvious, until you really think about it. It's exactly what you say. I mean, you say in the paper, to be not determined in any way would just be to be able to have an interest, but to act against it for reasons that also didn't conserve your interest. I mean, it would almost be nonsensical.
Right. It's sort of the ability to be completely mad, or like to do something that we would regard as psychopathic, or just
Hmm.
right.
Hmm.
But like that's hardly an ability in the sense of something one would regard as a good thing, right?
Yeah. And so this is something that I was really, I mean, I've been thinking about since reading the paper. It's okay. So it seems like you're totally right that you can't you can't just say because determinism is true, therefore, you know, moral responsibility just does not obtain in any way, right? Because of the counterfactual that you laid out. But I'm kind of wondering if, because it still seems like, okay, if we say that the thesis of determinism is true generally, that seems to kind of almost like open the door to the objective stance. Because if people weren't, if people were indeterminate in the way that you lay out, that doesn't make any sense, right? The objective attitude would be kind of odd, in my opinion, because it wouldn't be tracking anything. Like people wouldn't conform to patterns of behavior, right? Um, so if we do say that the thesis of determinism is true, I don't think that it, because of your points in both of the papers, I'm not sure that it either demands the objective attitude or even gives it some like huge theoretical weight. But I wonder if it gives it some kind of practical power almost. So the very fact that we are kind of creatures of all of our own times and we're determined by these things, it almost seems to kind of unlock the door a little bit to the objective attitude, and it makes it more efficacious. I don't know, does that thought seem to have any traction for you?
Well, it's interesting. I guess there are two totally different thoughts that your comments suggest to me. I mean, the first, your idea that, well, if determinism is not true,
Mhm.
I mean, in particular, I mean, I should, to be more specific, if like people are just not determined by anything and therefore kind of completely unpredictable, right? Because their behavior is random, and right, then the objective attitude wouldn't be appropriate, because it, I mean, I think what you're emphasizing there is the aspect of the objective attitude as a way of looking at people as to be managed or treated or handled.
Mhm.
Well, if someone is unpredictable and there's no handle,
Yeah.
you can't manipulate them because there's nothing to hold on to, right? I mean,
Mhm.
so in that sense, I agree. The objective attitude of, all right, I'm going to treat this as an instrument or a tool, which I will manipulate or negotiate with that way. That wouldn't make any sense but on the other hand, there's another way of thinking about the objective attitude as just not the reactive attitudes. I mean, the point is, not that you're actually successfully managing or handling or treating anything, but just that you're saying, look, this is not a person, not
Mhm.
a subject to subject kind of relationship. So you just have to, it's like, it's like living in a world of, you know, radioactive particles. It'll just go off at any unpredictable time. How do you do it? I don't know. Um, do you say I'm taking an objective attitude towards these particles? Well, yes, actually you are, even though it's of no practical value, but it's
Mhm.
the right value. You might still think it's better than the alternative. So I guess I don't think a kind of extreme non-determinism would not is incompatible with the objective attitude in that sense. But
Mhm.
the other thing I wanted to say, which is a completely separate point, is that um, the way I was thinking in that paper, and maybe in general, about what does it take to be responsible, wasn't, well, determinism has to be true in order for us to be able to be determined by good reasons. The thought is, it's more like this. It's that, look, there is an intuition that, or at least it feels like the right description of an intuition, that if determinism is true, then we're not responsible, the objective attitude is appropriate. But if that intuition were correct, it would lead to this paradox. And that therefore, rather than saying determinism is true or determinism isn't true, the point is to say, give up that intuition, or rather, it's not so, what I really want to do is not so much give it up as get underneath it, try to interpret it. Like, why does that seem like a correct intuition? Is maybe you're confuting something or not recognizing a distinction or something like that. And so it's not so much that I think determinism is true or that it's not true. It's that I think the connection between the truth of determinism and the absence of moral responsibility is what we need to investigate or raise questions about, because it leads to something paradoxical and incoherent.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I don't have, I've got mixed intuitions about that thought that I just kind of laid out. And I'm definitely still trying to work through it. I
can tell you one way in which this is one way of paraphrasing what I was trying to do in that paper. It's that, so what I actually think is going on is we have this intuition that if we're determined, we're not responsible. But the reason for that is that we're picturing determinism as like determinism by physical forces, right? Like I'm just being pushed about. So my belief isn't really a response to an argument, it's a response to neurons firing, which is a response to some other physical thing. And it sort of takes the psychological out of the picture almost, right? But if you think of determinism as compatible with psychology, with our, I can be determined, let's say I can be determined to believe that 2 + 2 = 4. Well, there's one way I could be determined to it, which is, a neuroscientist, tie some electrodes to my brain and implants that belief in me, right? All right, well, that would be one way of being determined to believe it, in which I deserve no credit, no blame. It's just like, and I am totally helpless with it. But the actually more realistic thing is that you're determined to believe that because through a gradual series of events, you learn arithmetic, right? You go to school, your teacher tells you, here's what, here's 1 pebble, here's 2 pebbles, who's 3 pebbles when you put 2 just go through it, and you're determined to reach that conclusion through this series of steps. But that series of steps is also the series of steps by which you actually, it's not just like I'm determined to have this belief, I reason to this belief. I mean, that's such a simple belief, maybe reason is right, but you build on that onwards. And when you think, oh, you're determined by reason and good education, like education has taught me how to, add, 3-digit numbers to each other, or education has taught me how to balance my checkbook, right? To think that, oh, well, I'm not responsible for it doesn't seem so obvious anymore. Determinism doesn't seem to undermine your ability to balance your checkbook. I know people don't write checks anymore, much less balance them on their own. So that was a really outdated example. But all right, we'll come up with some other example. But anyway, Right. So my one thought is, look, we get this intuition because we have a very narrow view of what being determined
Mhm.
by something would imply about us. And if once you get rid of that, the the intuition might kind of start fizzling.
Yeah. And you have, I mean, you have this one quote from the paper that I love. You say, I am claiming that whether an agent is morally responsible depends not on whether, but on how that agent is determined. And what you just said makes total sense. I mean, so you lay it out in the paper with the capital of Nevada is Carson City. And so you can ask, why do I believe that? Well,
Right.
one reason is you can spell out this deterministic picture about how, you were manipulated or taught into believing that. Well, another level of analysis is that you answered that because Carson City is the capital of Nevada. And so, yeah, I mean, I take it that that is where kind of your style of compatibilism really gets its grounding, is that we're determined in the right way. And that's how responsibility can be compatible with the thesis of determinism.
Right.
Okay.
Well, at least responsibility for good things.
Yeah.
That's the
Yes.
problem,
Yes.
right? I
Yes.
mean, if I'm determined to believe that Reno is the capital of Nevada, um, then there's a further question, like, can I be responsible for getting it wrong?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that, I mean, that asymmetry point there is so, it's such a cool, and really, I think it's a wonderful point because it's um it has a happy result too. I mean, we get to enjoy people really, and delve into the positive reactive attitudes, but it kind of undercuts the negative ones in a way, um which I love. And it seems so like it seems both, it's one of these points where it's both theoretically intuitive to me, but it's also consequentially just a wonderful conclusion also.
Uh, right. Well, it certainly mitigates a lot of the negative attitudes. I mean, I don't
Mm, actually
actually feel confident that we are determined, at least in the relevant ways, to do all the things we do. I mean, I don't.
hmm.
So, uh, so I do think some of the time we are responsible for doing the wrong thing,
Yeah.
because it's in the relevant way. I feel like I could have done better. I could have known better. I didn't. I failed, and
Mm,
the failure is on me. But it's not compatible with a certain kind of determinism.
hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
right. So,
Yeah. Yeah, which is motioning towards your point of, it's we have to be determined in the right way, I take
right,
it. Okay.
right,
Okay.
right.
That's super interesting. So you said, I know we're coming up on the hour mark, so I want to be mindful of your time, but you said you're kind of circling back around to responsibility questions again in your work.
Yes, right.
Okay. Okay, cool. What are there any kind of specific areas that you're looking to focus on again?
Um, yeah. I mean, I haven't changed my mind so much about anything, but but things are more complicated than I guess than I felt they were when I wrote those early things. One thing that I'm interested in is, and actually this is connected with your relative at the Thanksgiving table, I think,
Mm,
is the idea that when we think about responsibility, and especially when we think about responsibility for bad things, we have a certain paradigm of what it takes for someone to be blameworthy, which involves, which does involve some kind of freedom to do otherwise.
mm,
Um, and so the long history of people worried about freedom and determinism is focused on their ability to do otherwise. Um, and that's connected to a conception of being blameworthy that has to do with being accountable. I could have done it. It seems I'm struck now with the degree to which, um, even if you grant that a person couldn't have been expected to do otherwise at the time of some bad action. The fact that they're capable of doing better seems to me to be as important to responsibility as whether they were responsible at that moment, and whether they were blameworthy for that action at that moment. So basically, I think the thought is this: still sticking to Strawson and the importance of responsibility having to do with the importance of the reactive attitudes and the importance of being able to relate to each other with these kind of warm attitudes of, some of them positive, some of them negative. Seems to me we focus too much in thinking about responsibility on these individual acts that for which we want to hold people accountable, meaning, they should be punished or they owe us an apology, right? And I think of all the ways in which, the ways I relate to the people that I have personal relationships with, there's a lot less of that and a lot more of just kind of criticizing someone for having the character and values they have, or really being, feeling affection to someone for the character and values they have. It's not so much you're responsible for this action or that, or you're accountable. It's rather, why do you see the world this way? Why don't you think differently? And I think the ability to do otherwise, the ability to have control over it, becomes much less important than the ability to see the world right, which you don't have control. You don't have control. It's sort of implicit in my earlier views too. You don't have control over what values you actually have. You can try to be more open-minded, you can try to think, be more reflective, but in the end, you're going to have the values that seem right to you, which is not up to you to choose, right? And hearing an argument isn't necessarily going to change your mind in a minute. It might take years of, it's kind of magical. Anyway, the point, my interest right now is in seeing responsibility in a way and seeing what the real puzzles about responsibility should not all be placed on these moments of action and will and decision, and more on our ability to, which is not within our control, our ability to respond to the world in ways that are better and worse.
That sounds super interesting.
A little vague, sorry.
No, that sounds very interesting. So what I'll do in closing is I'll link both of the PDFs to the papers that we talked about. But if people want to kind of, I know you've written on many other subjects. Is there kind of a central website that I can point people to, or leave a link in the description for?
I've never been very good about managing, a website. I have a link through the UNC Philosophy, University of North Carolina Philosophy Department, which will link to a CV with, lots of things that I've written. But I've not been very good about trying to put it in any kind of order or explain myself.
Okay. I'll leave a link to the UNC website then. Susan, stay on the line if you would, but thank you so much for doing this. This was a ton of fun.
Yeah, for me too. Thanks for having me.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. I really, like I said to Susan after we ended the call, it's an amazing experience to get to talk directly with an author whose work I cite in some of my perspective writing. So thank you to Susan for coming on the show again. And like I said, I'll include links to her UNC Chapel Hill philosophy website, where you can find the list of all of her publications and written works there. If you want to support this show, you can do so by sharing it on Twitter or on social media generally. You can rate it on Apple Podcasts. You can like this video or subscribe on YouTube or on your RSS feed. You can discuss these episodes on your own show and link back to these, or you can connect me with guests or recommended topics to cover. And you can contact me at platoscavepodcast@gmail.com, and you can follow me on Twitter at Jordan_C_Myers. And as always, thank you for listening, and keep struggling to escape the cave.